Welcome to session 6 of our series, Kingdom Disciples, Heaven's Representatives on Earth. In this session, we're going to look at the church and the community. The job of the church is to multiply disciples. The reason why God wants every believer to become an active, meaningful part of a local body of Christians is so that they can be discipled and so that they can become disciplers. Because God wants you to replicate Him in the context of spiritual community. And when that community is let loose into the culture, then disciples functioning as salt and light impact the community that they live in and that they serve for the glory of God and for the improvement of the lives of people. Become a kingdom disciple because you are His official representative in history. The final two spheres of discipleship is the church and the community or the society. It begins with the individual, it moves to the family. But then kingdom disciples are trained and developed through an entity that God established called the church. When New Orleans was flooded by Hurricane Katrina, the storm came in, but the reason why the devastation took place as it did was because the levees failed. It was the failure of the levee that led to catastrophic consequences concerning a storm we could not control. The levees are built to hold back the water from doing the damage that it would otherwise be able to do. God has a levee in history. It's called the church. The church is God's levee. It's God's mechanism to hold back the forces of evil that would seek to devastate a community, a culture, and a group of people. It is unfortunate today that the definition of church has been dumbed down to be a weekly gathering of people for information and inspiration for an hour a week. Well, that's if you're white. If you're black, 2.5 hours a week. Many people have this backwards, even Christians. God is not going to skip the church house to fix the White House. He never starts with the political realm per se. He starts with His people. If my people who are called by my name. And the collective group that He calls His people is called the church. No better place to understand this than when God first used the word church in the Bible. Jesus uses it in Matthew 16. They're in Caesarea Philippi. Jesus says, "Who do men say that I am?" And they say, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're Elijah, some say you're Jeremiah, one of the prophets. But then He turns to His leadership, his ministerial association, if you will, and He says, "But who do you say that I am?" You don't see it in English, but in the Greek text, the word you is plural. So if Jesus were texting, He'd be saying, "Who do y'all say the Son of Man is?" And so He asked that to His disciples in verse 15. Simon Peter speaks up and he says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." He declares Jesus Christ, His messianic role and His deity. That leads Jesus to give two of the most important verses related to the church in all of the Bible. He says to Peter in verse 18, "I say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it." This is the first use of the word church in the Bible. He says, "You are Peter." That means stone. But I'm not going to build my church on a stone, a personality, or even a great preacher. I'm going to build it on a rock. The word stone is from the Greek word petros, And the word rock is from the Greek word petra. In classical Greek, the word petra, rock, was used of a collection of stones that had been knitted together to form a bigger boulder, cliff, or rock. It was stones hewed together. So it shouldn't surprise us that in 1 Peter 2, when he talks about the church, he says, ye are all living stones come together to form one spiritual house. So the church is the unity of God's people to form God's agency in the world to reflect his presence in history collectively. This word church, which literally means called out ones, the Greek word is ekklesia, it means called out ones, raises a question. Called out from what, to what, for what? What is it called out for? Now, most people would say, well, you're called out from sin to salvation, you're called out from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of light. All that's true, but what does it more specifically mean? Well, the word called out ones, ekklesia, was a common Greek word in the biblical times. In other words, it's not a uniquely Christian word. If you would be walking up the streets of Rome and you're walking up and down the streets of Rome and you run across somebody and you're talking, the word ekklesia, called out ones, would come up regularly in the conversation. Because called out ones referred to a gathering of people called out from the general population to legislate on behalf of the citizens. It's even used in the Bible that way. In the book of Acts, we're told in chapter 19 that the ecclesia came out to the court to pass laws against Christianity. Yet it's the same word, church. So it had to do with legislating. So the word church goes more than just information and inspiration. It includes the concept of legislation. The role of the church is to legislate from heaven to history. We are God's legislative body. We're like a Congress, a parliament, a city council. We are to legislate from heaven. We have legal authority. That's why it's a kingdom responsibility. The church has legal authority to legislate from heaven to history. America has embassies all around the world. An American embassy is simply a little bit of America a long way from home. If you go to a foreign country that's recognized, you will discover an American embassy. The head of it is the American ambassador. And in an American embassy, the laws of America rule, not the laws of the country in which the embassy is located. All embassies are sovereign territory. They do not belong to the country they're in. They belong to the country they're from. If you get in trouble and you're overseas, you want to get across that embassy gate, because once you get across that embassy gate, you're in America now, even though you're on foreign soil. The job of the church is to be God's embassy in history. It is where the values of heaven can be located in an institution in history, and where you can see God's prayer answered, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And it is the job of the church to reflect the rules of heaven. The reason why we have had so many problems, you take the racial problem. The reason why the racial problem continues to persist is that if God can't even solve it among his people, why will he fix it in the culture? If 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is still the most segregated hour, when the church has been called to be unified, then we shouldn't expect any better from people who don't know God. It is the church's job to proclaim, this is what heaven says, this is what heaven does, this is what we his people do, because this is what heaven says and what heaven does, and we will emulate that before a watching world. We will legally call heaven to us and then through us for the culture. I will build my church. How do you know whether your church and my church is his church? Because he says, I will build my church and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So the way you know that your church or my church is his church is hell is losing and not winning. Because he says the church that I'm building, hell's not prevailing against it. So what that means is a lot of churches are building their church while using Jesus' name, because hell is winning. He says, my church, hell can't defeat. So when you understand that this is the deeper definition of the church, worship is central, worship is critical, fellowship is central, inspiration with the word is central, but out of that should come spiritual legislation from heaven. Ephesians 3:10 puts it this way. It says, God checks with the church before he deals with the principalities and powers. So we're praying for God to change the powers when he first must be free to change the church, because he works through the church to the culture. One of the messages that I'm bringing to leaders around the country comes from 2 Chronicles chapter 15, verses 3 to 6. It says, during those times, there was no peace to him who went in or to him who came out. That is, everybody was in conflict, whether they were at home or when they left home. There was conflict everywhere. It says, city rose up against city. Then it says, nation rose up against nation. And then it says, for God troubled them with every kind of distress. If God is your problem, only God is your solution. If God is your problem, only God can fix it. But he says the reason that it happened was because there was no true God, no teaching priest, and no law. In other words, God had been removed, so chaos came. But here's the point. What was going to fix it? He says in verse 4, if my people would get together and call on me, if my people would get together and put me back in my rightful place, if my people would get together and they would get in sync with one another, I will let them find me to address what's wrong everywhere else. So God starts with his people first. That's my point. And his people today are those made up of his gathered group, his called out legislative body called the church. Now, hell wants to stop the church because it knows if it can stop the church, it can stop the legislation, that it won't be able to legislate. Why? Because God will not work in a divided church. In other words, he doesn't work in disunity. The whole book of Ephesians is about the unity of the church. That's the whole book of Ephesians. We can run right through it. The chapter 1 says Jesus Christ is the head of the church. Chapter 2, God works through the church. Chapter 3, when the church prays in unity, God does exceedingly abundantly above all you can ask or think. Chapter 4, he says the church is to be unified in one body, and when it's unified in one body, Jesus works through that body for the body to heal itself. Chapter 5 says the family is supposed to be the model for the church. And chapter 6 says when the church does spiritual warfare, it has victory over the devil. It talks about the unity and power of the church, that hell cannot prevail against it. Now, when the church is the church, God gives it, watch this, kingdom authority. Verse 19. I will give you the keys of the kingdom. I will give who the keys of the kingdom? The church. I will build my church, and I will give the church the keys of the kingdom. Now, what do you do with keys? You gain access to your house, to your office, to your car. You ever been in a hurry and not been able to find your keys? That means you're not going anywhere. Or maybe you're like me. You got a bunch of keys on your key ring, and some of them you don't even know what they go to anymore. So they're useless keys. Isaiah 22:22 says that keys are designed to gain access. So the keys to the kingdom has only been given to the church to give it access to the kingdom. Okay, listen to me now. The keys are not for the church. The keys are for the kingdom. It's for the kingdom of heaven. It's to unlock heaven's answers to earth's issues through the church. But we're using political keys, social keys, economic keys, psychological keys, and we're missing out on kingdom support. Because God's keys only fit kingdom locks. And the kingdom of heaven is the rule of God. under the lordship of Jesus Christ. I will hand you, when you're being my unified body of people, the keys to the kingdom. And therefore I will give you access. I was in New York, and I was at the Marriott Hotel in Manhattan, Times Square, because I was there for a speaking engagement. The speaking engagement was over. I had to check out, but I had to catch a flight to Chicago. I left the hotel, checked out, got on the flight, went to Chicago, and checked into a Hilton hotel. I checked into the Hilton hotel, got my room, went up to my room with my bags on a cold winter day, large hotel, went up like 30 floors, put the key in the lock, click, click, red light. Click, click, red light. Click, click, red light. So I'm evangelically ticked off now because it's cold out there. I'm going up 30 floors. There's no phone in the lobby to call anybody. And it's not working. I get on the elevator, go all the way back down, go to the desk and say, I am sorry, sir. These keys do not work. This key does not work. He said, that's because that key doesn't go to this hotel. I had not thrown away my Marriott key and was trying to use a Marriott key and a Hilton lock, and those kingdoms don't mix. A lot of us are trying to use earth keys in a kingdom lock and wonder why the kingdom isn't working for the church. We're using the wrong keys. We're not using the divine standard. We're using human standard, and then we sprinkle a little prayer over it, sprinkle a little Jesus over it, and think all of a sudden it has authority. I will give you the keys of the kingdom. And how do you know when those keys are working? Whatsoever you bind will be bound in heaven. And whatsoever you loose will be loosed in heaven. That's authority. That's kingdom authority, because the church is producing kingdom disciples. The issue in the church is not just having members, it's making disciples. It's not even just having Christians, it's making disciples. And if we're not making disciples, it's not the church. It may be a lot of things, but it is not a legislative body against the gates of hell. Hell's gates referred in the Old Testament to the place City Hall. It was the place where authority took place, where you swung open and closed the gates of decision making. That's why it says the elders would meet at the gate to render decisions in justice. It was a City Hall gathering. It says the only way you can stop the spiritual, what Satan is doing behind what you're seeing physically, is that you have kingdom authority. You know, when you watch a football game, there are 11 men on both sides of the field, 22 players. There's 52 players on each team. Then there are coaches. But there are only 7 referees, 7 refs. The players outnumber them. The players are younger, stronger, and faster. The refs are older, slower, and fatter. The players can knock you down, but the refs can put you out. Because while the refs are outnumbered, they have kingdom authority. They pull out that yellow flag and they shut that thing down. They blow that whistle and everything stops. And you better not touch them, because they carry kingdom authority, because they're being backed up by 345 Park Avenue in New York, where the commissioner sits, and you act out of line with their authority and you incur the wrath of the commissioner, because he has a kingdom and their jobs are to be authoritative representatives of this bigger kingdom in New York for every NFL game on every NFL field. And the fact that they're outnumbered by the crowd and the teams is irrelevant, because they've got authority. And by the way, you always know who the refs are because they got on that black and white shirt. In other words, they don't wear the shirts of these teams. They're not first Democrats or Republicans. They're not first black or white. They're not first rich or poor. They're kingdom disciples. And they belong to a group of officials who express authority in the midst of chaos on the field. And you know what their presence does? The presence of this officiating crew, it brings order to what would otherwise be a chaotic situation. The church's job is to give God's order legislatively in the world beyond merely what they do in service and in worship when they gather. And the job of the church, as it builds disciples, is to infiltrate and affect the community and the culture in which it is situated. Football teams have huddles. 11 grown men bend over to get a play called. But 100,000 people don't come to watch 11 grown men bend over. They don't mind 11 grown men bending over to discuss a play for a few seconds, but that's not why they came. You know why they came? They wanted to know, what difference will the huddle make? They want to know, having huddled, can you now score? They want to know what you're going to do about 11 other men on the other side of the ball daring you to go public with your private conversation. They want to see you score touchdowns. Every Sunday, there are huddles all over the country. And the preacher gets up as the quarterback and he calls the play. But God's people like huddling. In fact, they don't want to leave the huddle. They just want to stay in the huddle. The idea is to break huddle and go public. That's why Matthew 5, verses 13 to 16, gives you two analogies. It says, you are the salt of the earth, and you are the light of the world. In biblical days, salt was a preservative. It was used to preserve food. You are the salt of the earth. You're not the salt of the shaker. The only way you preserve the meat is for the salt to leave the shaker into the meat and become a preserving influence. You are the salt of the earth. He's talking to his disciples. He says, your job is to influence what's happening outside there in the world. You know what salt does? It preserves and it also creates thirst. I was in an Admiral's Club at the airport, and the lady came and said, would you like something to drink? I said, yes, give me a ginger ale. She went and got me a ginger ale, but she also brought a little salsa of peanuts and pretzels. I never asked for that, but she brought that. Because they know when you eat peanuts and pretzels full of salt, it's going to make you thirsty, so you're going to order another ginger ale. In other words, they bring that to create more thirst. Our job as salt is to be so influential in the culture, having been trained to be disciples by the church, that we make people want to take a drink of living water. That Jesus Christ becomes real. You and you alone, nobody else outside of the church and the disciples that the church develops are the salt of the earth. You alone are the salt of the earth. And he says, if the salt loses its saltiness, it's good for nothing, except to be trodden under the foot of men, verse 13 says, of Matthew 5. What does that mean? The roofs in Israel are flat. And so in the roof, they used them like porches. People would walk on the roof, wedding receptions, gatherings. Peter went up to the rooftop to pray. So there was a lot of walking or trotting of the foot. Well, the way the roofs were built, they weren't built sophisticated like we have them today. Holes over time would get in the roof so it would rain in the house. So they'd have to patch up the roof. The way they would patch up the roof is they take gypsum, mix it with water, turning it into a paste, put it over the hole, let the sun bake it, turning it into a hard clay so they could then trodden their foot or walk on the roof again. But now the salt was good for nothing. He says if the salt would lose its saltiness. Now that's interesting because you can't have saltless salt. Salt is only made up of sodium chloride. If you take sodium chloride out of salt, you don't have saltless salt, you have no salt, because the only thing in salt is the sodium chloride of salt. Okay? But Jesus says that the salt can lose its saltiness. Well, he's telling us how. Because when they patched the roof, they mixed the water with gypsum, coagulated it with salt, turning it into this paste, so that gypsum is bitter, so that you can no longer taste the saltiness of salt. It would be overridden by the bitterness of the mixture. What has happened is We're being walked on by the world because we've gotten so mixed up with the world that we've lost our unique tastiness in the world. And the church has become saltless salt. How can we have all these churches on all these corners with all these people, with all these members, all these programs, all these buildings, and still have all this mess? There's a dead monkey on the line somewhere, and that is we've not broken the huddle and entered the culture with biblically spiritual, kingdom-based, discipleship-directed impact and influence. He says, you are the light of the world. Last time I checked, the role of a light is to shine. Okay? Therefore, he says, a light is lifted up. Why? Because the higher the light is, the more influence it carries. You are the light, not of the bulb. You are the light of the world. If the room was dark and pitch black, that means there'd be chaos because we'd be walking to each other, walking in the chairs, we'd be walking the walls because we can't see. The Bible declares that this world is dark and you are the light. So if this room were dark and I had a flashlight, I now carry the influence. Now you can decide whether you want to follow me with the light. You would be a fool not to follow me with the light because I'm the only one with the light in the room. You are the light of the world. What good is being a light and you're off? He says, you are the light. You are to display, having been trained to be a kingdom disciple, the influence of being ruled by the king and his kingdom as you make that light available to the world. Everybody's not going to accept it, but they ought to see it. And how do you do that? Verse 16 says, let men see in society now your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Let them see it. Glory means put on display, advertise, put it on a billboard. Let them see your good works. A good work is more than a good thing. Sinners can do good things. They do good things all the time. A good work is a biblically authorized thing for which God gets the credit. That's a good work. If God is not part of it, it's a good thing. It's not yet a biblical good work. When God can get glorified because we're doing it as representatives of Him and we're benefiting people, we should be the most beneficial people in society to hurting people, helpless people, homeless people, poor people, struggling people, because we are the light. And he says when men are affected by the good work of God's people trained to be kingdom disciples by God's institution, the church, and they see your good works, they will glorify your Father, not their Father, because He's not their Father yet. But because you've done it in His name, they will recognize your Father because you did it unapologetically in His name. So kingdom disciples affect communities, they affect cultures, they affect society. If Jesus comes back tomorrow, we don't have to worry about any of this. But if He doesn't come back for another 200 years, you better worry about all of this. Because it's your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. They're going to grow up in some kind of world. Either it will be a world infected and affected by disciples who are kingdom-based, or by disciples of hell, who brings hell's authority in the history because God can't get His people to move. If Abraham just could have found 10, God would have saved Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah did not have to be destroyed. The only reason it was destroyed in spite of the darkness, morally, and the oppression the Bible talks about in that city, those cities, the only reason it was ultimately destroyed was not merely because sinners sinned, but because the saints couldn't be located. The saints that were there were so individually oriented that they had had no influence during the time Lot and his family was there. They had become culturalized and therefore lost their influence. Abraham couldn't find 10, so God had to judge it. If you care about your community, your city, your state, and your culture, give God a reason not to judge it by having kingdom disciples as doctors and lawyers and business people and housewives and homemakers and teachers and principals and every discipline of society. Be excellent in their work, but being representatives of the kingdom in their influence. So that when God looks and says, I can delay judgment because the presence of my people, I will not judge the righteous with the wicked. See, we can change the trajectory. And that 2 Peter 3 says, God is waiting on you. Didn't say he's waiting on the world. He says, I'm waiting on my people. When I can get them right, then I can affect the environment in which they live. You know, in television and in movies, they give you previews of coming attractions. These are always the hot clips of the upcoming show. It's the love scene, the fight scene, and the chase scene. And they string those right behind each other to make the show look exciting to look at. They're advertising it so that you'll tune in. Now, the show may be terrible, but you'd never get that from the clips, because the clips are always exciting. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, one day there's a big show coming to town. God is the producer, the Holy Spirit is the director, Jesus is the superstar, and it will be a worldwide production. It's called the Kingdom of God. When Jesus Christ comes back and he rules this in his millennial reign, he will make the whole earth right so that it functions as it was created to function. But in the meantime, he's left us here as previews of coming attractions. We're supposed to be the hot clips of the upcoming show. When people see his kingdom disciples at work, they're supposed to say, that's a hot clip. That's a hot clip. That big show must be something special. And when they see the hot clips located everywhere, because we are kingdom disciples, believers who have progressively learning to bring all of life under the lordship of Jesus Christ, then they can ask, where can I buy a ticket to the whole show? Oh, that's when you can tell them, you don't have to buy a ticket because the price has already been paid. God bless you as you become a kingdom disciple.